Good evening. I would like to thank everyone for joining with us today. Myself, Pritili and I am a trainer at Modak Trainer Academy, a platform driven by vision and values. Today's deliberation, locating the Namasudra Matuas in Post-Colonial West Bengal, presented by Debopam Gangopadhyay. He is currently pursuing PhD in Sociology at Presidency University, Kolkata. He also have an experience of teaching sociology at Scottish Church College for over 6 months. Not only that, he is also a net set qualifier. Now, without any further delay, we will turn the time over to Debopam. Sir, please start your deliberation. Thank you.
Thank you. Firstly, I would like to extend my thanks to Gargi De and to the Academy for giving me the space to deliver this lecture. I'd also like to thank my supervisor, Professor Antara Ray
Excuse
from
me,
Presidency.
Debopam, excuse me, you are not visible. Please switch on your camera.
Sir, you
Yes,
are visible. Sir, you are visible. I think there was problem on Gargi ma'am's system.
Okay.
Continue, sir.
Okay, thank
Continue.
you. Please.
Okay. Secondly, I'd like to extend my thanks to my supervisor, Professor Antara Ray from Presidency University, and to also my RSC guides, Professor Shukarna Sharbadhikari from Presidency University, and also to Manoj Kumar Panda from Presidency University. I'd also like to thank my friends and my colleagues for helping me to discuss some of the ideas and concepts that will be deliberated in this lecture, and also to people in my field where I have done my field work in Thakurnagar and also in the larger area of North Chobish Pargona, my respondents. So let's start. If one looks at the topic firsthand, locating the Namasudra Matuas in post-colonial Bengal. So I would like to concentrate on the words already present in the topic, that is locating the Namasudra Matuas, post-colonial and West Bengal. Now, if I start to concentrate on these words, one will see already the themes are present. Locating has its cognate, local, or let's say location. Namasudra Matuas is the community I will be delivering upon. Post-coloniality is a subject to which this lecture will have a problematic relation with, okay, such that it won't deny the post-coloniality of the present situation we are living in, and yet it won't totally accept to that view. And West Bengal is the place and is the space in which we are having this occasion here. And also the problems which I will be dealing with in this lecture is relevant in West Bengal. Now, we all know that caste as a social category is pervasive if one observes or reads Indian society. Not only just as a category for reading interpersonal relations, it has condensed and reached histories of hierarchy, resistance, and assimilation. Until this day, there has been several perspectives in trying to build this inventory on the history of caste. Each reading has developed its own set of oppositions. I will be meandering on this reading as we go along. Each reading has developed its own set of oppositions, its own binaries, and has been driven by social and political interests. Thus, in locating the process of subjectivation of lowered castes as political subjects, it is necessary to identify the interests and the politics associated. In this part of my work, which has commenced and is now subjected to revisions and thus provisional in nature, a work in progress, I would like to bring together an overview of the process of subjectivation and how, in and through that very process, the lowered caste, the marginalized castes, appropriate and is appropriated. Two things: appropriate and is appropriated in battling for a meaningful structure which will provide them with self-respect and dignity. Before going to my central arguments, I would therefore like to revisit some of the perspectives used for analyzing caste relations and social structure of the Indian society from the colonial times to the present. It is while revisiting through these different times that I have tried to locate the formation of the Motua community in Bengal as political subjects. The Motua faith has emerged from the Namasudra community in 19th century Bengal, and though it is broadly based within the community itself, it has its own share of engagement with other religious faiths and communities. The word Motua comes from the Bengali word Matoara, which translates into ecstatic. This translation, as will be seen as this word develops in time, is not innocent, as like all other translations. How a particular faith coming to presence in ecstasy changes its grammar into that of identity politics. I repeat, how a particular faith coming to presence in ecstasy changes its grammar into that of identity politics will be one of my central concerns. This concern is one where I delve into the process of subjecthood. I take subject here as being referring to a certain position whose ground or socius is being shaped by certain forces and whose articulation is alienated from its Dasein being there. I will be pondering on this concept, Dasein, as we go along. I will return to this obvious Heideggerian reading at the end of this account. How this subjecthood is revived and retained by the process of selective appropriation. Selective appropriation with the rise of neoliberalism and the advent of globalization forms the core of my research. So before going to the readings, different readings of caste, and then to my intervention, I will be firstly clearing upon my subject position within this field of research and with respect to the Motua community at large. I am from a Hindu Brahmin family at Santoshpur in South Kolkata. Growing up, though caste had never directly came into being, I was surrounded and clothed by its grammar. Not only Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, but also other social reformers of the late 19th century and early 20th century, the likes of Phule and Periyar, spoke and wrote about the psychological and economic barriers which disabled the Indian population of sharing and partaking in a nation successfully. Thus, the higher one is placed up on the caste rank, the more caste practices seem normal to him or her. Both sides of my parent come from the eastern parts of Bengal, but with different socio-economic statuses. Hence, their migration took very different paths. My paternal family settled in Kolkata, while my maternal family settled at Bhadrashwar, Hooghly. By the time I was growing up in Santoshpur, the landscape was already changing as part of the nationwide impact of the neoliberal development. Empty spaces and old houses was giving way to flats and restaurants, and the roads were becoming easier to travel along. Real estate projects like South City and Highland Park, the latter one very near to my home, were cultivated on industrial and agricultural lands respectively. Ajaynagar, Jadavpur, Dhakuria, Taliganj, all these spaces have worn new clothes in the past 30 years or so. However, there are pockets within these areas which place themselves as lacunas or as ghettos, places where development's invisible hand hasn't reached in the same ways. In a similar way, Bhadrashwar too has changed massively, with e-commerce making inroads slowly and steadily. The usual stereotypes between a metropolis and a town are slowly dissolving away, at least apparently. Although in Bhadrashwar too one finds pockets of places in areas nearby, a quote-unquote I love Bhadrashwar, such changes and ruptures have always been there in my mind. Listening to my mother's stories about her childhood and the migrated families in Bhadrashwar, I usually took these distinctions to be a matter of time lag and after a certain point of time, a difference in occupational roles and hence income levels. Never could I fathom the pattern that existed right before me, even in terms of images, if not in words. The dirty canals, the relatively dark and slim alleys, the dress codes, the whispering conversations of two or more people in one or the other points where two or more narrow lanes intersected, and the shouting that almost burst open from the small shabby houses, though getting no responses from the neighborhood save one or two smirks or, if luck permits, surprised faces. I couldn't even make out the pattern about my parents' and relatives' use of adjectives in describing certain places. As I was growing up, I learned one day from my mother that one of her uncles, who migrated from Moymonshing to Ichapur, always got very angry whenever someone labeled him as a Bangal. I was surprised. To me, being a Bangal was a pride and a unique marker in case of food and language. Although I never could speak the language and ate food according to my taste, Bangal and Ghoti both in mixing within me, I still romanticized that identity. It was in that moment that I came to know that Bangal refers to things outside sport, food, and dialects. I learned that there were two colonies near Bhadrashwar railway station, upper and lower. I also learned that most of the people living around and near my home in Santoshpur were without, quote unquote, proper documents pertaining to property and citizenship. I started to notice the places and utensils that were reserved, highlighted, for servants, salaried persons for cleaning and maintaining the houses and utensils. This impression stayed with me, and as I write, I recollect and bracket them. They are not appearances, but apparitions, or one might say, phenomena to me. Now, here I stop for a moment to discuss the difference between appearances and apparitions. In the case of appearances, there is always, if one follows the trajectory of, let's say, both, particularly in the case of Western philosophy, also there is that presence of it in Indian philosophy as well, one will always find a dichotomy between appearance and reality. And in thus following that trajectory, there is always a dichotomy between subject position and object of knowledge. So, but with Kant coming into the picture and with the rise of modern philosophy, this appearance reality dichotomy got dispersed away, and a new dichotomy came into place. That is the apparition and the conditions of apparition. So previously it was that I am seeing, let's say, a table or a wall or a fan or, let's say, a landscape, and it is having an impression upon me. So my mind is like a blank slate and it is having impression from the external objects that I am seeing. But with the rise of Kant, what is happening, what is uniquely happening in Western philosophy and consequently across the whole world, is that mind is being seen as an active agent and not only as a passive slate, as a tabula rasa. It is not only receiving impressions, it is not only passively accepting external images and external objects, it is also molding and transforming them. So as if I am wearing a blue sunglass and seeing the external world, so all will appear blue to me. So Kant is saying that we all wear different sunglasses, and what we see, what we refer to as external, is always already subjectivized. So there is no subject-object dichotomy as such. So when I speak of apparition, I do not take in that subject-object dichotomy. Okay. So, yes. So there are not appearances but apparitions, or one might say phenomena to me. So when Kant disperses this subject-object reality, he brings into the play the dichotomy of noumena and phenomena. And he says that we can only gather knowledge about phenomena, and we can only intuit about noumena. We can never know noumena. We can only know about phenomena. Okay, and the rise of phenomenology in Western philosophy is, let's say, with the intervention of Kant. So, is caste some essential marker in the Indian subcontinent, or is religion? Hundreds of books have filled the shelves following these questions, and more are on their way for good reasons. However, when I started reading the works of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar during my master's course at Presidency, I was surprised to see a certain phrase hauntingly present in two of his most important works concerning the historical formation of the Shudras and the untouchables with a capital U. That phrase was work of art. Now this phrase, work of art, is present in Walter Benjamin. This phrase, work of art, is also present in Heidegger. We will be coming to it in the later sections. How imagination play a crucial role in understanding historical gaps so as not to fill them, but to reconfigure, to reshape the sense of temporality, and thus to reimagine the future. So we have an idea of, let's say, this is my history, this is my present, and this is my future. Now this conception of past, present, and future, I'm conceiving this, let's say, this tripartite division by sitting here in the present, right? But if one starts to question the present itself, then one gets a different trajectory. So one starts to question, if that could have happened in history, what would have been the present? And if that could have happened in history, if this would have happened then in the present, then how can we imagine the future? So a whole new conception of his past, present, and future comes into being. And it comes into being through the work of art, through the role played by imagination. So it's this constant negotiation between history and memory, between imagination and politics, between history and politics, that is brought out to play in Dr. B.R. Ambedkar's works, and also in works of, let's say, Heidegger, Walter Benjamin, and also Karl Marx. So this last sentence, that not filling the historical gaps but to reimagine the future, this last sentence can be said to be the starting point of my research. Although ambitious, I find in it a place of refuge, a place where language emplaces us to grant a certain mode of exposition or articulation. I immediately recollect the Horisabhas that I have never visited until and unless I started visiting my field in North Chobbish Parganas, but I've heard the songs and music resonating through electronic mediums. Such Sabhas not only are a time of disgust for the established urban educated middle class, but I find that taste of disgust working in the aspiring to be middle class Matuas as well. They refer to texts and commentaries and question me as to where Horichand or Guruchand Thakur lays such importance upon rituals. So Horichand Thakur is the leading figure of the Matua movement, and Guruchand Thakur is his son. They refer to anthropo-historical discourses to quote-unquote expose the growing levels of Brahminical beliefs within the Matua sect. There are also other Matua or Dalit representatives working in or retired from government services who speak about the three treacheries of Matua Gosais in fooling the lay household devotees. Household devotees are also being criticized in public gatherings for keeping idols or pictures of Krishna, Shiv, Kali, and other quote-unquote Brahminical or Vedic gods and goddesses along with Horichand and Guruchand in their houses. The demand or claim for socially recognizing the Matua as a distinct and separate religion other than Hinduism is being made too. On the other hand, in Shimulpur, Thakurnagar, the village that I have chosen for my fieldwork, I see and meet people with a disdain for the Thakurbari, which they see as the local authority representing the state and the central governments. They complain about the corruptions and negligence of the Thakurbari at Thakurnagar. And some of them even go to such lengths as saying that Thakurbari and some of the Gosais have played a part in dividing the Hindu community and creating social barriers. So we get two opposite images from the two stratas within the Matua community. Now, how to ground these two pictures? How to see and place them side by side? Are they just reacting to one another, or are there larger social processes at play? It is this crux where there is a need to go beyond the theory practice or subject-object divide and use art and imagination. In another word, poesis, which is also a word I have taken from Heidegger, to speak for and of a community whose access to resources, whose social security and comfort, whose public avowals are largely instrumentalized, and hence, in place of creating a possibility of being social individuals, the social reproduction of isolated lonely individual and herd, the two binaries. One is the isolated lonely individual, and another one is the herd. So we often use terms in Bengali like, let's say, aka, and the opposite of that, bhir. Now I am problematizing this binary because to me, the ones who are aka can only find themselves in bhir. Okay. Now, the social reproduction of the isolated lonely individual and herd continues in the name of democracy and universal franchise. So these are the problematic areas and, let's say, the research questions which I am trying to go through in my work and which I have started, let's say, for over a year in my PhD work. Now, about the readings and its overviews. So primarily there are two readings. One is the colonial reading and the other is the nationalist reading. And there is also a critique of these two readings, which is popularly known as the subaltern critique. Now, in the nationalist reading itself, there is the Marxist reading. Now, why I'm placing the Marxist reading within the nationalist fold, I will be coming to it. Now, this is not my position, this is the position of the subaltern critique only. I won't be taking the position of the subaltern critique, my position will come at the last. I will be concluding with that position. So let's start with the colonial readings. There have been several scholarly works. A study on each of them is beyond the reach of this presentation, which points that an ideology of quote-unquote colonial difference or quote-unquote a discourse of differentiation was put into effect while interpreting the subcontinent's social relations and structure of society. This colonial difference from the side of the perspective of the colonizer worked in two ways. The Christian missionaries, while claiming religion to be the fundamental axis of social organization in the Indian subcontinent, pointed to the backwardness of the subject or colonized population in civilizational terms. So the civilized barbaric division. The phenomena of untouchability and ritual hierarchy on the basis of purity and pollution were addressed as obstacles in the process of converting the colonized to Christianity. Thus, there was a need to bring these people out of their quote-unquote barbaric life. On the other hand, there was the Orientalist reading of caste, which projected an image of an ideal Hindu society in the past, which broke down due to the Islamic invasion, and hence the British, according to these administrators, ethnographers, are here to rebuild Indian society anew. So these two, let's say, broadly speaking, these two readings within the colonial reading itself. So one is the Anglicist reading of the Indian society and the another one is the Orientalist reading of the Indian society. And if one reads the 19th century parliamentary debates in Britain, one will find that the Anglicist won. Okay, so Macaulay was a representative of the Anglicist tradition and not the Orientalist tradition. Whereas one will find that the Orientalist tradition gained a huge influence and ground in Germany, such that Max Muller was a representative of the Orientalist tradition. And we know that following Max Muller and his works, at the end of the 19th century, figures like Vivekananda and alike were referring to Max Muller's works in reconfiguring and reorganizing Hindu religion. So that's another part of the story. So, but both of these views, this Anglicist view and the Orientalist view, centered their conceptions of social relations, keeping in mind an ideal picture of Europe. From the late 18th century right until the first War of Independence in 1857, we can find several initiatives being taken by the colonial administration, primarily among them being the permanent settlement in 1793, which brought a permanent rupture in the contours of the subcontinent's social life. In 1817, the History of British India by James Mill got published, and this was the first official historical, in the disciplinary sense of the term, account of undivided India. This text, the History of British India, this text can be considered to be an exemplary case of colonialist attempts of trying to grasp an unknown way of life into its grasp. In it, we find a periodization of history in communal terms. The history of India was divided into Hindu, Muslim, and British periods. The origin of two-nation theory can be traced to this writing, and in it, the Hindu nation, quote unquote, the Hindu nation was vilified for being barbaric to its outcasts and women. The data that was being observed and interpreted, moreover, was being taken from Brahminical texts translated by upper caste Pandits. Therefore, right from the beginning of history writing in colonial India, Brahminism found its way into colonialist perception of India. After 1857, as the subcontinent came directly under the crown, the government took a different approach in ruling over the subject population. The administration's perception as to the cause of mutiny was that they were being too interventionist in the affairs of everyday lives of the native population. So one has to remember, in the case from 1800 to 1857, in this period, there were figures like Raja Ram Mohan Rai and Vidyasagar who were collaborating with the British in order to bring reforms. They were not just critiquing the British policies and administration, they were also trying to reform the Indian society as well. So the British administration were conscious of these policies of intervention following the mutiny. So after 1857, as the subcontinent came directly under the crown, the government took a different approach in ruling over the subject population. The administration's perception as to the cause of mutiny was that they were being too interventionist in the affairs of everyday lives of the native population. It is from this time that a politics of nativity was being practiced as part of governmental measure by the colonial administration. An indigenous elite had already started to take shape after Western education, since the early decades of the 19th century established itself through schools, colleges, and universities. The likes of, let's say, if one takes into example Kolkata, the likes of Presidency, Scottish Church, and Calcutta University. It is important to note here that this indigenous elite had a precise upper caste character, as no members from the outcasts or depressed classes, as they were then called, were allowed to enter into these institutions. To get a detailed survey of territory, and in order to map and identify and hence classify and categorize the subject population, the decennial census was brought into being by the colonial government. In 1881, the first census was published. Now, census practice was underway post 1857, but the let's say as a national program. The first census that was published, it was in 1881. The logic of enumeration that the politics of census carried out had several impacts. First of all, it presented a homogenized picture of caste, rank, and hierarchy all over the Indian subcontinent through its espousal of the Varna theory of caste. Secondly, it totally ignored the fluid religious practices of the indigenous downtrodden and further engendered a Brahminical tendency by distinctly characterizing the ranks and hierarchies of the population segmented into various tribes, castes, and religions. Thirdly, it first gave communities, castes as well as religious, a demographic sense through which we would find in the later decades a horde of caste tracts coming out in response so as to claim a higher rank in the census classifications. So we will find throughout the 1890s and the first decade of the 20th century, many so-called middle castes and marginalized castes sending, let's say, genealogies to the let's say census officers in order to claim that they have a certain ritual hierarchy which were denied to them by the so-called upper caste. So they have a certain history of being upper caste, but they were being marginalized at a certain point of history. And now, while such processes are now being taken, so they are sending to the colonial census officers these genealogies so that when the census classifications will take place, they are being put to their rightful places. This kinds of processes was being, let's say, was happening in the last decades of the 19th century and in the early decades of the 20th century. Now, why I'm saying this? Because within this process, the Namasudras played a part. Okay, because today, the community who we name as Namasudra weren't called Namasudra before, let's say, 1911. From the 1911 census, we can find that they are being marked as Namasudra in the census. But before that, in the 1901 census, in the 1891 census, in the 1881 census, they were being marked as Chandals. Okay, so there is a famous saying within the community that in 1911, what happened was Chandalotto Mochon hoyechilo. Okay, and Guruchar Thakur played a part in doing this work. So let's come back. So this was the colonialist reading of caste. Now let's come back to the nationalist reading of caste. In confrontation with the colonial case, the nationalist writings of the Indian past worked in the paradigm of colonial difference. Only this time, there was an inversion of power while taking account of the world. True modernity and real freedom was to come only with the departure of the British and the coming of the Congress to power. The bureaucratic and legal institutions were seen to be problematic only because of the persons who were involved in running them. The nationalist account also saw Indian history divided broadly into Hindu, Muslim, and British. Partho Chatterjee, in his works, has claimed that the nationalist vision, in the nationalist division, there was a division of the empirical and the spiritual being made. The empirical or the scientific deals with the economic, scientific, and technological developments that the British brought to India. The spiritual, cultural deals with the inner world of the indigenous population where they have to retain their originality. Now, this discourse which Chatterjee speaks about can be easily found if one goes through the writings of, let's say, Vivekananda or Mohendra Datta. Okay, two of the exemplary figures, but it can also be found in, let's say, in other writings as well, and the writings of, let's say, in the Matuas texts and commentaries as well. One can find it. One can find also such discourses in the texts of, let's say, Sharadama and Anandamoyi Devi. Okay, all the religious figures one can find this this division between the empirical scientific and the spiritual cultural being made. It is through this split that the nationalist accounts of Indian history is to be understood. Caste system was considered a part of the Indian tradition. So it was being considered as a inner domain, as a spiritual or cultural domain. The perception regarding the caste relations and the system of the nationalists was largely shaped by the colonialist account of caste. In order to tackle and fight with the backwardness imposed upon them by the British, nationalist leaders like Gandhi and Nehru all spoke of against untouchability, but regarding caste structure and hierarchy, which in fact gave way to untouchability, in general, they took very different and ambiguous stance. We all know about the famous debate between Gandhi and Ambedkar regarding this. Gandhi believed that untouchability is not the essence of the caste system and only an aberration which is needed to be removed by raising the awareness of the upper caste people. The spirit behind caste, according to Gandhi, is not one of arrogant superiority, it is the classification of different systems of self-culture. I highlight the word self-culture. It is the best possible adjustment of social stability and progress. The nationalist perception can well be understood by the Hindu revivalist trends of the 19th century, where we can find questions of social reform coming up to the fore side by side to the search for specificity / indigeneity of the Indian traditional values. It is in this light we have to understand the ways in which claims around Swadeshi were being made, or how Bal Gangadhar Tilak promulgated the celebration of Ganesh Puja as a collective space where to unite and construct a national attitude in opposition or confrontation to colonial powers. It is needless to say that these arrangements and practices of constructing or reclaiming a national culture bore a Brahminical outlook to India's past. Thus, the very tendency of the nationalist attitude or culture politics was to integrate and differentiate the variegated forms of life of the colonized subject population. It is not very difficult to say that such processes of integration and differentiation were never very smooth. Claims and agency making were crucial to different marginalized sectors of the population. Now I come to the Marxist position, and I will be, while deliberating upon the Marxist position, I will be showing how it shares certain common assumptions with the nationalist account. Regarding the Marxist position, there have been many arguments and counter-arguments pertaining to their stand with respect to caste. The one which has been politically pertinent is to regard caste as a component of the superstructure whose base belongs to the feudal ties and modes of production. Now we all know that there is, in classical Marxist viewpoint, there is this stagist model. So one starts from primitive communism to slavery to feudalism to capitalism to socialism. Now, in, let's say, in Marxist outlook, and we can find this in the various Marxist historiographies as well, that caste relations is a matter of, is a component of the feudal relations. It's a component of the feudal ties that have been there in the Indian subcontinent. So it's part of the feudal ideology. And ideology, as we know it, is a component of the superstructure. It's not a component of the economic base. It's not a component of the mode of production. But it's that part which keeps the mode of production alive. I'm speaking of the classical Marxist viewpoint. I'm not talking of, there have been many, there is no one Marxist viewpoint, there are many, but I'm talking of the classical or the orthodox one. So, the one which has been politically pertinent, that's why I'm saying it, politically pertinent, is to regard caste as a component of the superstructure whose base belongs to the feudal ties and mode of production. Here we find an orientation in a slightly altered form, perhaps, which harps back the notion of social evolution and development as progress. Although scholars like Sumit Sarkar, in engaging with post-colonial theory and subaltern historiography has reimagined ways of configuring and theorizing caste identities and histories, the orthodox practice of seeing caste as a feudal or archaic remnant to be swept away by developmental programs and initiatives prevail. So you will also find this rhetoric of unnoyon very much prevalent in, let's say, all the parliamentary, those who take part in the parliamentary space, the communist parties of our country, this rhetoric of unnoyon. Hence, though we find that communist politics and movements engaging with the peasant community in various parts throughout the 20th century, they haven't been successful in recognizing and giving voice to the claims of the marginalized castes agency. On the other hand, they have faced attacks politically of being caste blind and biased to dominant social structures. The Marxist position, thus, is fraught with the conception of economic critique of colonialism, first articulated by Dadabhai Naoroji in his book Poverty and Un-British Rule in India. So what binds together the nationalist reading and the Marxist reading of caste is what I say as the economic critique of colonialism, or one might say a form or a sort of economic nationalism, as opposed to the cultural nationalism of the colonialist account. Or one might even say a cultural nationalism of the recent, let's say, happenings we are seeing all over our country. So we also find a rhetoric of cultural nationalism in there too. As opposed to that, we find in the nationalist, or let's say in the Marxist reading, a kind of economic nationalism. So here is how Partho Chatterjee, on elaborating about the rationality of the new state, new post-colonial state being formed in 1947, here is how he expresses the concern. Now I'm quoting Partho Chatterjee here. Why was it necessary to devise such a modality of power that could operate both inside and outside the political structure constructed by the new post-colonial state? Now, when he's speaking of this modality of power, he's referring to the Planning Commission, the National Planning Commission, okay, and its functioning in the polity of the Indian state. So why was it necessary to devise such a modality of power that could operate both inside and outside the political structure constructed by the new post-colonial state? An answer begins to appear as soon as we discover the logic by which the new state related itself to the nation. So the nation state, we know, is marked by a hyphen. Okay, nation state is not a single word. It is a compounded word. It is always marked by a hyphen, and that hyphen is what I am trying to problematize. So for the emerging state leadership, I am continuing with Partho Chatterjee. For the emerging state leadership, this relation was expressed in a quite distinctive way. By the 1940s, the dominant argument of nationalism against colonial rule was that the latter was impeding the further development of India. Colonial rule had become a historical fetter that had to be removed before the nation could proceed to develop. Within this framework, therefore, the economic critique of colonialism as an exploitative force creating and perpetuating a backward economy came to occupy a central place. Colonial rule was illegitimate, not because it represented the political domination by an alien people over the indigenous. Alienness had acquired the stamp of illegitimacy. So political domination was not the issue. Alien rule has turned out to be the issue. So alienness had acquired the stamp of illegitimacy because it stood for a form of exploitation of the nation. The drain of wealth, the destruction of the productive system, the creation of a backward economy, etc. So returning back to my account, now one can easily notice that it is not hard to readjust the nationalist response of why colonial rule was illegitimate against them by using the Marxist viewpoint of seeing the Congress leadership as compradors to the British Crown and hence as one of the prime obstacles of real development in the country. So the relation between the British Crown and the Congress was now being seen by the Marxists as the relation between them and the Congress. So Congress was being seen as a comprador class, the ones who are subservient to the British Crown. So the British had left, and now the emerging power, the emerging superpower, America, had taken the place of the old imperialist powers. So the Marxist critique was the Congress was subservient to this superpower through its foreign policies and economic policies. So the relationship between the outside and the inside, the foreign and the homely, okay, remained intact through the, let's say, the institutions, the bureaucratic institutions, the legal institutions, the economic institutions, all of them. Now here, who is important is Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. Now the contradiction which Dr. B.R. Ambedkar in his Annihilation of Caste talks about at length was about how we find the significance of the social conference, which was, one has to remember, which was a part of the Congress, okay, back in 19th century. Though committed to social reforms, was restricted to reforms measures concerning upper caste Hindu families. So social conference was only concerned about reformulating or reconfiguring upper caste Hindu families and problems pertaining to them. It wasn't considered about reconfiguring Hindu society as such. And Dr. Ambedkar blamed the social conference for not doing so, for ignoring to do so. And it also pointed out that social conference failed in its program, particularly because of this reason. That because it narrowed down its program to upper caste families. So in effect, we find that the nationalist and the Marxist positions speak from the same paradigm, out of which arose the colonialist interpretations of Indian reality. However, these positions fail to grasp the energy and aspirations of the multitude who struggled for a better society and future in more ways than one. It is here that the subaltern school of historiography has been helpful to give voice to these different stratas of the population, who claimed in variegated ways their everyday oppression and left behind, quote unquote, small voices. I'm referring here to Ranajit Guho. Small voices, an inventory of which goes against the grain of grand narratives pertaining to democracy, modernization, and secularism. Now, there is not much time left. I'm just saying, I will be directly delving into my intervention. I have, while speaking about the nationalist reading and the colonialist reading, I have spoken of in parts and bits the subaltern critic. So I'm not delving into the subaltern critic in detail. So I'm starting with my intervention in what I have developed now until so far. So this section is known as the notes on appropriation. So as in the introduction I mentioned about that how the Matuas and the Namasudras is appropriating and is being appropriated by the politics. So that process of appropriation I am delving upon now. The history and politics of caste reform and movements in Bengal cannot ignore the role of Namasudra community and the Matua faith, whose seeds rest within the community itself. However, that history has a checkered past, and there have been concerns. Yes. Yes.
Sir, nothing. You continue.
Okay. However, that history has a checkered past, and there have been concerns regarding incorporation into the Brahminical fold. Any collective identity in a society does not operate independently on its own. We know from Ambedkar's writings that the problem of caste arises from the question of surplus women. So, Ambedkar in his, let's say, first work, or one might say in his speech at Columbia University, Castes in India, spoke about this problem, that the problem of caste arises in society from the question of surplus women. Hence, how caste identities responded to colonial modernity is to be understood according to a particular social and historical context. The Namasudras cannot be thought of in a monolithic manner, and questions of class often cuts into the demands for the community as a whole. Only when the demands of the elite and the subaltern sections of the community converged did the Namasudra identity create a social impact. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, the Namasudra community, then called Chandals, as I had previously spoke about, consolidated itself mainly through the social reform measures taken by Harichand Thakur and his son Guruchand Thakur. The lowered sections of the Hindu community were acculturated within the general society by various socio-religious movements ranging from Sufism to Vaishnavism. In fact, Harichand Thakur himself was born in a Vaishnavite family. Facing ostracization early in life, Harichand came to this self-realization that there is a need to develop a religion that would be based on the upliftment of the Namasudra community as a whole. Until 1872, the Namasudra community was not consolidated in social and cultural terms. Whatever opposition to caste society was there, it depicted itself mainly through ritual practices. In 1872 to 73, following an event of humiliation in which a Kayastho didn't come to a funeral ceremony of a Namasudra family, the Namasudras started a social and economic boycott against the caste society. It was through this movement in the eastern part of Bengal, especially in Faridpur, Bakarganj region, that the Namasudras started consolidating themselves in cultural and political terms. The main factors through which movements such as this motivated itself were self-respect and dignity within the Hindu society at large. The primary tools through which social mobility was imagined were representation of the community in the census classification, like demanding the name of Namasudra to be given in place of Chandal in the census, which they successfully managed to do from the 1911 census, as I was speaking earlier. And also through education. So one was representation of the community in the census classification, and another was representation of the community through education in the various institutions that was coming about. Thus, from the late 19th century, we see various caste genealogies coming up both in the colonial ethnographic accounts as well as in the indigenous literature. These caste tracts spoke of how the Namasudras were once originally Brahmins but later fell off the caste ladder. Also, it spoke of the issues related to peasantry and education. In the final decade of the 19th century and the first decade of the 20th century, with rising grain prices, there occurred a change in the rural organization, thus amounting to a social pressure on the upper caste Bhadralok with the arrival of a certain section of elites from the Namasudra community who were from the Matuas faith as well, in direct engagement with colonial administration. It was at this time that the colonial administration in 1905 decided to divide the Bengal Presidency. Remember, this is also the time when the Swadeshi movement starts happening. So, this step undertaken by the British made its way differentially to the different communities present in Bengal. This differential reception, this is very important, this differential reception fitted well both within the colonialist discourse that the ethnographers and administration had laboriously built up and the agrarian hierarchies present at that time. The upper caste Bhadraloks launched Swadeshi by boycotting foreign goods and involving themselves in what the administration labeled as terrorist, quote-unquote terrorist activities. But Swadeshi didn't make itself much appealing to the Namasudras, as they felt that the division of Bengal would present them with such a social situation where their demands for self-respect and dignity would find better soil for growth. It was during this time that we find several reform measures being taken by the upper castes to retain the outcasts within the Hindu fold, thus otherizing the Muslim population. With the Molla Monte reforms of 1909 advocating separate electorates to Muslims, and with the decision of E.A. Gate, another colonial official, to not include the untouchables within the Hindu community in the 1911 census in which the Namasudras were marked. first time. We find serious attempts by the Bhadraloks in attempting to eradicate untouchability without, however, recognizing the autonomy of the marginalized communities. So this process, which leads to the, let's say, debate in the Pune Pact between Gandhi and Ambedkar, the origin of that debate starts here during the Swadeshi period. So the Bhadraloks involved in the attempts of reconfiguration and rethinking came from the various subjective positions, starting from self-critical approach of men like Rabindranath Tagore to individuals like UN Mukherjee, who advocated Brahminical ideals in his approach to the caste question. It is important to remember that caste reform measures occurring throughout the early decades operated under the general rubric of the Hindus being a dying race. Now we can find this rhetoric, Hindus a dying race, till now. So it is important to remember that 100 years have passed. This A Dying Race was published in 1909 for the first time. Today is 2025. Now, let's say if tomorrow, if a census takes place, we will again see a discourse coming up that Hindus are decreasing, Hindu khatre mein hai, and so on. So that discourse of Hindu khatre mein hai has its origin in the early decades of the 20th century. So it has its own history. It's not something which is, let's say, 300 or 400 or 500 years old or going back to 800 years old. It has a certain kind of nationalist and casteist history, and which shares a very problematic relation with the caste reform measures. So communal techniques and methods of appropriating outcasts and otherizing the Muslims started to make itself felt as a crucial element of the Bhadralok responses to questions of Dalit Muslim alliance. Throughout the last 3 decades of the colonial period, marginalized caste politics in Bengal got divided into various streams, championed by different political parties and organizations. So today also, when we find different political parties and organizations claiming different communities and projecting themselves to be the true representatives of that community, this phenomena too has a history in the colonial regime. Now, I am not saying that this too, let's say, the phenomena that took place in the colonial times and the phenomena that is taking place now are the same, but they are analogical. So there is something analogical, there is something from which we can find a pattern, and there is also something new. So both of them are present, the analogical and the new. So there is also this tension between the history and politics. History is always about finding the patterns in the past. It's always about finding the analogy in the past. And politics is always about imagining new possibilities. True politics always lies in the realm of possibilities and in the realm of new possibilities. So okay, very few time left. So throughout the last 3 decades of the colonial period, marginalized caste politics in Bengal got divided into various streams championed by different political parties and organizations. There were Depressed Classes League, Depressed Classes Association, and Scheduled Caste Federation. The Scheduled Caste Federation was being led by Ambedkar, and Ambedkar has with him Jogendranath Mondol. So we know of Jogendranath Mondol from writings of Debesh Rai, Borishale Jogen Mondol, and also Jogendranath Mondol's son has written let's say a 7-volume biography on him. So, and Ambedkar went into the Constituent Assembly with the help of Jogendranath Mondol. So it is also important to remember the relevance of caste politics and caste issues in colonial Bengal, which got problematized with the occurrence of partition and the politics post-partition. So let's come to the conclusion now. Now, let's say when we refer to as Dalits, when we come to the question of Dalits, and speak of Dalits not just as a quality or attribute. Okay, so the Dalits are those persons who are being trampled upon or who are being marginalized upon. But Dalits as those persons who have an agency. So Dalits from being an adjective to a noun. Now this shift is taking place with the movement of the Dalit Panthers. Okay, now Dalit Panthers was a movement that took place in Maharashtra in the early 70s, and they mainly figures like Namdev Dhasal and J.V. Power, and it was mainly a literary, socio-political, cultural movement, and inspired by the Black Panthers in America. So this relation between America and India, this negotiation between America and India started from Ambedkar. Okay, so Ambedkar went to Columbia University. He had a tremendous influence, not only educationally, but John Dewey, figures like John Dewey had a tremendous influence upon Ambedkar. So this negotiation and engagement between America and India started from the times of Ambedkar, and we will find it also in movement like Dalit Panthers. But what complicates issues is that with the advent of globalization and with the advent of, let's say, movements like consumerism and neoliberal economic policies being taken into account, what happened is that two things started to take place. Now I am just because so little time is left, I'm just summarizing my point. Two processes started to take place with the advent of globalization and with the rise of consumerism and neoliberal economic policy. One is the production of individuals, and the other is the production of, let's say, spectacle. Now, what problematizes the Dalit discourse, or let's say the Ambedkarite discourse broadly, is that Ambedkar spoke of producing modern individuals, individuals who are educated, individuals who had in themselves a certain kind of rational sense of feeling, individuals who can, let's say, judge, who can, let's say, reflect upon, and also individuals who doesn't remain isolated, individuals who give something back to the society. Okay, so Ambedkar spoke of a social individual. With the advent of globalization and with the advent of the neoliberal economic policy reforms, what happened from the late 80s onwards is that this tension got bifurcated, such as the individual stands in opposition to the society. The individual stands in opposition to the spectacle. Now, so we find that there are huge Dalit processions taking place. There are huge Dalit rallies taking place. On the other hand, we will find Dalit atrocities gaining in number day by day. We will find Dalit, let's say, professionals in every sphere. There are questions of representation, I'm not denying them. There are obvious questions of representation, that there are seats which are not given to the SC and STs and OBCs and Adivasis. Okay, there are these questions, these are policy matters. I'm not going into that in this debate. But the fundamental question is that as we see the rise of Dalit professionals in various spheres of public life, so also we see the rise in the number of Dalit atrocities in post-colonial India. Now, how can we place both of them together in one picture? Now, this pertains to the question I was asking as a part of my research project, that how can we place the two pictures in the Matua community together? So I claim, and this is my submission, that this development has taken place due to the subsumation of let's say, the villages, the towns, let's say, the mofussols as such, into the economy of the city, into the economy of the urban life, and into the cultural space of what we popularly call as Madhyabittu. So you will find, if any one of you search in the Facebook reels, or let's go into the YouTube interviews, or search through TVs, one will find that anyone in India today calls himself a middle class. Now, Madhyabittu or middle class has become a fashionable word. From, let's say, figures like Shah Rukh Khan to figures like one we find in, let's say, in our tea shops, everyone will call himself Madhyabittu or middle class background. So middle class background is now open to anyone and everyone, such that it is not marked. On the other hand, what has happened, that you can find rather, the subsumation of agrarian economy and, let's say, rural economy into the urban fold, such that the urban rural divide is no more visible. It's not that it is not there, it's no more visible. So with the rise of the entrepreneurship and the startups and all these self-reliance projects, the so-called Atmanirbhar Bharat, this policy, the rise of this so-called, it's not only with the Atmanirbhar Bharat, it's also, let's say, it has its beginnings from the PPP model, public-private partnership model. I'm not going into the detail of that because of less time. So with the rise of all this subsumation, okay, of the rural and the agrarian into the urban, and the opening of the middle class, what has happened is the so-called empirical or spiritual domain that I was speaking about, the empirical or spiritual divide that I was speaking about, and the civil and the political divide, which is a result of that empirical or cultural divide, has got problematized. And since it has got problematized, what has got also bamboozled is the public-private domain. And we can see it in our everyday lives. Previously, religion was a matter of private domain. Now religion is a matter of politics. So, and this is not a phenomenon which we can point to, let's say, BJP is the ultimate evil or RSS is the ultimate evil. No, it is a larger framework. A larger social process is taking place in the last 30-40 years in this country, where the public-private dichotomy, the empirical spiritual dichotomy, and the urban-rural dichotomy is being bamboozled, is being blurred, and is being questioned by the neoliberal onslaught, economic onslaught, and the globalization process. And this gives rise to a certain kind of identity process, certain kind of identity politics, which was not what Ambedkar talked about when he talked about annihilation of caste. This is not the identity politics that Horichand Thakur and Gurichand Thakur talked about when they talked about Matua faith. Because being Matwara is not about identity. It is about self-effacement. It is about finding yourself in the larger sphere of things. But identity politics, as we know of it today, and we see it in all kinds of casteist,
Excuse me, sir.
Yes.
Sir, the time is over, so
Okay, let's 1 minute. I'm just ending
okay.
with a one sentence. So this identity politics that we see today in the dominant, let's say, Dalit politics, or let's say in the feminist politics, or let's say in any other, let's say also in the liberal sense, this identity politics is not what, let's say, Ambedkar talks about, or what Horichand Thakur or Guruchand Thakur talks about. How this identity politics takes shape in the past 4 decades, in the past 3 decades, is what I am trying to research upon. And in trying to research upon this, I am trying also to delve upon what kinds of processes, rituals, practices can be found which are emancipatory in the Motua texts, hagiographies, and commentaries. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you, sir, for your excellent presentation. So there is no time for question answer. So now I'm going to invite our advisory board member, Professor Matuas Das Gupta, sir, to complete the session. Sir, please.
Good evening, everybody. It was a nice lecture. I enjoyed this very much, but the subject is so vast and there are so many points open, thrown open to discussion that many questions could have arisen. But as time is short, we cannot take questions from the viewers, from the members of the audience. For example, the very different Professor Dr. Debopam Ganguly, he has cited some points on the difference between Ambedkar's movement and Haricharan Thakur's movement. One is on Dalits and one is on Namasudras. And Namasudras against Matuas are Namasudras, but all Namasudras are not Matuas. And again, Ambedkar's movement was religiostic, while in Haricharan Thakur's movement, there is an aspect of spirituality, and in both there were mundane affairs, cultural affairs, and then again mundane affairs. Haricharan Thakur stressed on intellectuality, but Ambedkar didn't stress on this intellectuality, and so on and so forth. Therefore, there are so many questions, and actually time didn't permit, so he could not take all the points. But we have had a bird's eye view on Haricharan Thakur's movement, this Matua movement as it is commonly called, and the one is at Ambedkar's time, Dalits were not political pawn, but now Debopam Ganguly has very nicely and rightly pointed that these Matuas are political pawns, and this was one. This has stood in the way of actually Matua movement, and Matuas have uh, bifurcated among themselves, which is not actually fair for Motua movement, whatever it may be. There are so many questions, so many possibilities, so many debatable points also. But on the whole, we have had a bird's eye view on Haricharan Thakur's movement and a social, socio-political background of this movement and its situation at present. And also, he has peeped into a global aspect of the movement. And we know that it is an age of globalization, and there are three types of globalization: the spontaneous globalization, induced globalization, and forced globalization. And thus, there has been so many ups and downs in such movements. He has rightly pointed out some aspects. Many more things can be deliberated on, I believe, but what we have had from him is very interesting, and I am really indebted to him for this interesting lecture. On my personal behalf and on behalf of my academy, I convey my best thanks, gratitude, and well wishes. to Sri Debopam Gangopadhyay. Wish him best.